as much as we like our car, we like Valtteri more, and happily he was able to come out of that with not much more than a bruised knee from the impact. But it was a big crash. What caused the puncture on Valtteri's car on the laps to the grid? Well, as you know, we monitor the pressure in the tyres, and on the second lap, we could see that it was starting to lose pressure. So this was on the intermediate tyre. Now, we knew that it wasn't going to get terribly low just on the short distance he had to travel round to the grid, so we warned him that there was the puncture. That's useful for him because if he pushes too hard in a corner, he could get caught out by the lack of grip. And when we got onto the grid, we could actually see the cause, which was some debris had punctured a hole through the tread in the tyre. So it was right in the middle of the tread. And it must have just been that he was unfortunate, rode over something on those laps. And it's actually quite hard for it to go all the way through, but it did. It was losing air, and obviously that tyre wasn't available for use during the race. So what was the performance loss from the damage to Lewis's wing after he made contact with Max on lap 1? Well, initially it was quite large, and the reason for that was because the footplate of the front wing hadn't come away completely. It was actually held on by the pressure tappings that we use to measure the aero performance of those parts. And while this was flapping around, it was causing a big loss, so around 0.6 of a second that was affecting him in the opening laps. Now, eventually, that bit of the front wing fell off completely, and that was actually quite good for Lewis. It halved the loss. So what we were seeing later on was something like 2 to 3 tenths, but that affected him through the whole of that intermediate stint and in the early part of the stint on the medium tyres. Now, happily, that was the only damage that he'd suffered. And when we got the red flag, we were allowed to fix damage on the car so we could put on a new front wing, and it was back to being normal. Why did we not keep Lewis out longer on the intermediate tyres? Well, when you get these crossovers, the trick is always to try and pick the exact lap that when you go to dry, you're quicker than you would have been on intermediate tyres. And everyone's trying to do this in and around that period of the race. We were watching the Aston Martin with Sebastian Vettel, who was the first to do it. And we could see that the tyre initially wasn't going to be quicker than the Inter. Now, Max changed before Lewis, and Lewis was able to do a quick lap on the Inter. It was actually his fastest lap so far in the race. But Max's medium tyres are generating more and more temperature, and they're picking up grip on his outlap. Conversely, Lewis's intermediate tyres are going to get hotter as the track's drying. So Max will only get faster, Lewis is only going to get slower from there. And we'd already seen that Max was actually gaining about 0.2 of a second in that critical period in the middle of the lap. And had we left Lewis out longer, that gap would have grown. So the right thing to do was just to make the change when we did. And we couldn't really get any closer than that. So how can we improve the pit stops? Well, it is fair to say that we're not the best. We are losing time in the pit stops, and it's an area that we have been focusing on for a while now. In particular, though, in Lewis's stop, we did have an issue with one of the pit stop guns. For the next stop, we actually changed to a different gun, and that seemed to resolve that issue. And also, there was a short hold. We had to hold him for around 0.4 of a second because Giovinazzi was coming down the pit lane just at the point that Lewis was ready to go. So, as I said, there were some specific instances that affected us in the race in Imola, and we'll look to work on those. But longer term, we're still looking at what we can do with the crew, with the equipment, to try and find a bit more time in the stops. As you saw, it did take a bit of time for Lewis to get out of the gravel, back onto the track, and there were a few reasons for that. The first was he was just working out whether he could get out of there going forwards, which was difficult because he had the tyre barrier right in front of him. And then his only option, he'd realised, was to reverse. Now, that's a lot easier said than done. Apart from the fact that you haven't got good visibility, reversing over gravel is difficult, and there's a very high chance that you're going to get stuck. It also took Lewis a little time just to get the car into reverse. It didn't go in the first time he requested it. It eventually got in. And happily, when he started going backwards, he managed to generate a bit of momentum, got through that gravel track, which, to be honest, could have really finished his race there and then very easily if he'd got the car beached. And then happily, when he was back on the track, the suspended race meant that he was able to recover that lost time, recover that lap that he was down. Even though he was in 9th place, he was still fighting for good points, as you saw at the end. Why couldn't Valtteri overtake, though, when other cars seemed able to? Well, there's a few key differences here, but in particular, Valtteri was finding it hard to get close to other cars on the intermediate tyres. He was struggling for temperature, and that lack of temperature, particularly early in the race, just manifests itself as a lack of grip. And in particular for Valtteri, when he got close as you'd need to be to make a passing move, the front grip was dropping, and he was washing out and couldn't really follow at a distance that would allow you to pass. Now, the other factor was in that intermediate stage, the DRS isn't enabled. And when you can get in the tow, when you can trigger DRS, you can actually gain around 0.6 of a second just from the combined effect of those two things. So that was something that wasn't available to Valtteri at that stage, which was to Lewis later on. But the key thing was really just the balance of the car, the understeer that he was picking up when he got close, and the fact that that meant he couldn't get the gap down to enough to launch an attack. So are the W12 and Valtteri okay? Well, as much as we like our car, we like Valtteri more, and happily he was able to come out of that with not much more than a bruised knee from the impact. But it was a big crash. We were seeing around 30 G at points in his sort of trip around the walls and the track. Unfortunately, the car's not done quite so well, so there's a fair amount of damage to that. We've managed to bring a lot of it back to the UK. We've got the power unit at Brixworth where that's being checked and inspected carefully. And we'll just pick through this, and some of the bits we might be able to salvage. Unfortunately, quite a lot of it is damaged beyond repair. And we're just looking at a logistics plan to try and be able to get sufficient parts to Portimao, which is the week after next, to make sure we can run both cars in the correct spec. After that red flag, a number of cars went for the soft tyre. We chose the medium. Now, why did we do that? Well, we know that the soft is going to give you a small advantage in terms of warm-up, but from what we'd seen with the work on Friday, the medium was actually the faster tyre. Once it was up to temperature, that would have an advantage in grip. The other thing we'd seen, maybe more so based on the year before, was that the soft tyre had quite a lot more degradation. However, in the race on Sunday, it held together very well. But the medium tyre was good for us with Lewis in particular, because he was able to really attack, to push, the tyres weren't overheating, and that was how he was able to make those overtakes to fight through the field. So what caused the slow tyre warm-up? Well, a lot of cars use the heat generated from the brakes, and bear in mind that the brakes can run at 800, 900 degrees towards the end of a braking event. They can channel that heat into the wheel rims, which then gets its way into the rubber of the tyres and can bring them up to temperature. And this allows you to sort of push and pull the warm-up, but it tends to give you a bit more degradation on a long run. Now, this is a tuning tool that a lot of the teams were using, and it may be that we need to look at how powerful the effect is to which we can heat the tyres and whether there's more that we need to do going forward in that regard. But it's one of those areas that we're going to review ahead of the next race. Pizza or pasta? The truth is actually, I went to Italy and I didn't eat any of them because we only had dinner on 3 occasions, and sorry to say, I had a takeaway curry on every time because it's a bit of a team thing. I did, however, have something called gnocchi with a G, which is like a strange mix of mashed potato and pasta. And I did have that for lunch. But overall, I would say, for me, pizza would win out. But as I say, on this occasion, all the restaurants were shut. We weren't allowed out of the hotel. So takeaway curry it was. Thank you for sending all your questions in. We're going to be back after the next race in Portugal.